Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rice. Senator Fawcett.
Acting Deputy President, I wasn't planning to speak on this bill, but having just heard some of the concerns raised by Senator Rice, I just wanted to make a very brief contribution. Going back to when David Forsyth, not Fawcett, Forsyth, ran the inquiry into Australia's safety regulation for aviation, I worked with the then Minister Truss to actually travel much of Australia and speak at many of the same forums and get feedback from people. And one of the issues that was raised consistently was that there were multiple occurrences where the requirements of CASA were bureaucratically correct but didn't actually have a safety outcome, and in some cases advice was given by CASA to industry which they then didn't follow through from because they had a complete they basically didn't care about the economic impact. An example being somebody who wished to bring an aircraft into the country. It was not the first of type. They approached CASA, did all their due diligence about how long it would take them to bring the aircraft in and get it cleared. They debt-funded the aircraft. It arrived and then sat on the tarmac for months because they didn't get the paperwork cleared by CASA because there was no regard for the economic impact of a lack of action on behalf of the regulator. Things like check and training. My own aviation background, 23-odd years with both the military and flying in the civil sector, things like check and training, there are very sensible economies that can be had. For example, as a pilot flying multiple types but a similar category aircraft, a twin-engine aircraft that's rated to fly in instruments, you can do an instrument rating on one complex aircraft and it very comfortably translates to another aircraft in the same category, even if it's a different brand, if you like, of aircraft. And yet I'm hearing from the industry great concerns that CASA are now requiring them to do multiple tests every year on different aircraft types, even though they're in the same category. And so there's things that are not really economically viable for an individual pilot or a company that don't actually contribute to safety in a large way. And I speak from experience with that. So I hear the concerns, but the origin of this amendment goes back a number of years to when there was a very extensive consultation with both operators and pilots and aircraft mechanics, the LAMEs, into how CASA approached their regulation. And so the desire is not to provide an avenue for someone to say, well, we think that's going to lose us some profit, so we're not going to do it, but to actually say, can we achieve the same safety standard and take account of the economics for a small business? That was the intent that came out of the Forsyth Review and the associated discussions, and this has bounced around now for a number of years. I'm very pleased to see that the opposition has been able to work with the government to come up with a form of words that make sure that we keep companies viable, because I've got to say the safest company, or a safe company, is a viable company. A company that's scraping to make ends meet is far more likely to also end up taking shortcuts. So I commend the bill to the House.
Thank you, Senator Fawcett. Senator Patrick.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. Centre Alliance will be supporting this bill. Mr Acting Deputy President, I have a pilot's licence. That's not to say I would recommend anyone fly with me, but I do have them by virtue of the fact that they are perpetual. I don't have current hours up. But what that leads to is some background in relation to some of the things I'm going to say, and that is that when I learnt to fly back in the 80s, I was a bit confused as a submariner, wanting to go underwater and then wanting to fly on the weekends. You could go to just about any airport in Australia and there was a flight school. And you could, you'd go to that flight school and you'd do your pilot training, very, very professional. Well, it was a bit expensive, but nonetheless that allowed you to learn to fly. And from that, most pilots, they would learn to fly, either get their private licence or they'd get their commercial licence, move on to commercial activities. And it was those pilots that then went into the GA sector, the general aviation sector. And unfortunately, we've reached the situation where Senator Rice is talking about aircraft not flying to rural areas. They're not flying to rural areas because there are no pilots anymore. There are no planes. And I'll give you some statistics on that shortly, because everyone has been priced out of the market, not because they're unsafe, but simply because of the overburden of regulation that CASA imposes upon general aviation. I'm sure if you put all of the documentations required to fly in the back of your Cessna, it simply wouldn't take off. It would be so heavy. And to be very clear, the United States and other countries have a much slimmer sets of regulation, and they have much more traffic flying in their airspace in much harsher conditions. Australia is blessed in many senses because we always have relatively good weather. We don't have to worry about significant storms or de-icing aircraft before we take off. So we've got a relatively safe environment compared to other nations that have regard to the fostering of the industry, and that has not been happening here, and it hasn't been happening here because of the legislation which requires basically only the consideration of safety. Now, Senator Rice is very correct in saying safety is really important, but it's one factor. If you want to have safe flying with no risk of accident, then don't let anyone fly. That's the extreme position. We've got to find the right balance, and right now the balance has not been struck correctly. General aviation is in a perilous state. The Bureau of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Economics did a report in 2015 that showed GA declined 18% from 2010 to 2015. We've had AOPA suggest that this means we've lost about $500 million per annum of economic activity out of the Australian economy. Not to mention the very devastating effect that this has had on regional communities. I've been involved in the inquiry into regional airfares, and we find that one of the contributing factors to high airfares is simply that airlines like Rex and QantasLink can't get pilots. They can't get pilots, and that adds to the cost of people in regional communities flying, even when we've moved into the regular public transport sector. And that flying is the lifeblood of some of these regional communities. It's the way in which people get to education. It's the way in which people get to health. It's the way in which businesses connect. It's the way in which agriculture flourishes. And if you make things so expensive, what then happens is we end up with a doctor decides to leave the town because they can't go back on a regular basis, or it's too expensive to go back on a regular basis to visit family. They leave the town, and then 5 other people decide to leave the town. So it has a flow-on effect on regional communities. So whilst the economy has had 103 quarters of continuous growth, at the same time general aviation had experienced a 34% decline in pilot numbers over 10 years. 34% decline over 10 years. There had been a 35% decline in avgas sales over 10 years, which is an indication of how little people were flying. 18% decline in aircraft hours over 5 years, and a 20% decline in the serviceability of aircraft for a 12-month period, and a 15% decline in maintenance and repair organisations over a 12-month period. I've mentioned some of this is a fantastic feeding or training ground for pilots that go into regular public transport, but we also have the organisations that do pilot training, the organisations that do charter work, the organisation that does testing, that does ferrying, does surveying, does photography, does aerial work. Unfortunately, we're seeing pilots in these regional areas, they're almost becoming extinct. And that is harmful to Australia. It's harmful to our regional communities. And it's not about saying, let's not be safe. It's about, in some sense, reconfiguring CASA so they don't bombard people with regulation after regulation after regulation. We've got this industry in decline, and it hasn't improved since that 2015 report.